Good evening, guys. Thank you, Miss Tiffany, for this opportunity. So yes, guys, we are going to dive into understanding, because of this month and in particular, but really truly understand what does it mean when you hear the term African American. And historically, we definitely need to understand that because really there's a lot to unpack as it relates to that. So really, when we talk about African American history, we're really talking about our history, right? And when we say our, we're talking about the history of humanity. So my first slide deals with how did we even get to understand that February is Black History Month? Here is a man named Dr. Carter G. Woodson, second to graduate with a history degree from Harvard, second African American to graduate. And so what he realized at the time of him being the second African American to graduate from Harvard, he began to truly see the story of the African American was not being told by African Americans. And so at that time, he began to create the study of Negroes' life and history, and it's called a Sala. And so he said, well, in order for this to be important, we need to make this a week. And so he started it out calling it Negro Week. And the reason why he chose February, because of two important individuals that a lot of people always connected themselves as it related to the relationships of African American. Abraham Lincoln, the man that passed the Emancipation Proclamation, and his administration that also helped push through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that talks about freeing the slaves and then making them citizens and giving them the right to vote. So Dr. Carter G. Woodson and then also Frederick Douglass' birthday is in February. So that's why he chose February. So here is the father of Black history. And he spent his life really expounding and getting more Black scholars to write the African American experience as it should be told from an African American perspective. So that's one of the greatest things about understanding history is there are people who have already paved the way. So let's get to what I wanted to talk about. So why do we call ourselves African Americans? So one of the reasons why we call ourselves African Americans because we got to take our history back to Africa. And Africa is so important because Africa will explain more than just African American history. So the reason why we call ourselves African American because our ancestral line links us back to Africa. And also, according to scientists, it's the human evolution line. This is the beginning of all humans. So it does not matter what ethnic group you ascribe to, you are part of one race called the human race. And the human race evolution begins in Africa. And so we will see on the next slide the evolution and the migration of how Africans will walk out of Africa and leave Africa and will begin to populate the world. And we know that this is true because scientists have went out there, and we know that there is a biologist who has a documentary called Journey of Man, where he took the DNA of the oldest family and he matched the DNA of every place of these migration stopping points. And he matched the DNA of the oldest family to those DNAs. And he made a great leap in his study of how the human line and how humans migrated. And so when you look at the word human, it's a compound word. The word hue, H-U-E, and that's why in the English language, a lot of times when the letter is silent, you can drop it off and you can change how you spell the word. So hue means color, and then man. So human means man of color. So we're all people of color. Now, it's determined differently, and I'll show you based on this map. So here's the map of human migration. So the reason why, especially starting here in Africa, all of the people in Africa are dark skinned is because they are closer to the equator. And so your environment dictates what do you need physically, as in your physique, as in your body. So people who live in hot climates typically need darker skin, because the darker skin creates your original vitamin D, which helps protect you from the sun rays. You need thick lips, broad nose, and real matted, thick hair, because when you sweat, your sweat becomes your natural air condition. So as migrations began to change and people began to move, they left Africa. The first group left Africa and then went into what we would call Australia, and so forth and so forth. And then as they moved from Australia, so there are originators of Australian people that still live there today. And then you have the Australian people that we know that come from England. So once they left there, they'll have this meeting point, and in the midpoint of where Europe is, there are two groups that will split off. One group will go towards Europe and create what we now call anybody that's from Europe, Europeans. And when you think about the physique of a European, you think about they don't need to be dark because they are further up in climate-wise, so they are further away from the sun, so they don't have sun on a consistent basis like down here. So you don't need darker skin. So your skin eventually, like if you notice sometimes in the wintertime, you get lighter. That's because we are not exposed to sun on a consistent basis. So over time, you get the skin tone of what we call Europeans. The nose becomes narrow, the lips becomes a lot thinner, and hair now, instead of being real thick, it comes and lays down to cover the body to protect you from your environment. So everybody is based on your environment. And so once you move out of Europe, the other group began to move towards Russia and also into Asia. And when you look at those who are make up of the Asian community, they have more of a yellow tint, and they live in a more of a valley, so their eyes are different than most people. And, they have the same kind of thin type hair, so forth and so forth. And then from there, you had the people that was able to leave because they were nomadic people because of their food source. They left and went into North America, and we call those people, I use the term indigenous people because they are the people that was here first in North America, but Columbus called them Indians, but they're not Indians based on he was not in the right place. And so you have those people. And so when you look at Asians and you look at the Native Americans, is another term, you can kind of see some resemblance. And they are the people that came over, and they created the oldest indigenous groups, Native American groups, the Olmecs, the Mayans, the Toltecs, and the Aztecs. Those are the four oldest indigenous people. Now, some people decided to stay in North America, and then some went on down into South America. And so you have all of the human evolution starts out of Africa and then begins to spread. And as they begin to spread, the changing of what their features look like changed based on the environment that they were in. Here I have a question that says, what do you see in this picture? And in this picture, you're probably going to tell me you're looking at these pyramids that I had from the other slide. But I would also like to say these are high mathematics and high science to build these, because when you look at it on one surface, it looks like just a regular triangle. But really, it's built as a square, and as you keep going up, the shape of it shifts and turns into a pyramid. Well, that's a three-dimensional shape. So how in the world can you make a three-dimensional shape stand up like these pyramids? So they had to understand high mathematics to even put this together. So the base of the pyramid is based on what the number a lot of us have learned in mathematics, pi. And so they've learned the base of pi when they were building these pyramids. And this is before pi was even being introduced. So these individuals knew high mathematics, and they built these great monuments, which are still called the seven wonders of the world. And also what is very interesting about these are definitely pyramids are built for tombs for the great kings of the time. And all three of these point to a specific star in the sky. So these Africans were in tune not only with the land, but with the world as a whole. And they studied the universe. Matter of fact, one of the first universe you will see, I'll show you, the reason why they use the word university is because they studied the universe. They knew the stars. They knew all about the contour of the land. And these things represent that. And this is coming from Africans. So the land of Egypt, I'm going to use a different term because Egypt is a Greek term. So the Greeks used the term Egypt. But the Africans did not call the land Egypt. They call it Kemet, K-E-M-E-T, Kemet. And if you think about the word Kemet, that is a root word for a science called chemistry. But what's so important about Egypt, right? Because Egypt is the children of Nubia and Cush. But however, we do point and pay attention a lot and we talk about Egypt because Egypt has had this great zenith moment in time in history where Egypt was the center point of, if you were from Europe, you went to Egypt and learned. So what makes Egypt what it is? It has the Nile, and the Nile and the Amazon are the only two rivers in the world that flow from south to north. So we usually say we go down south, but they say they go up south based on the way that it is. And so it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile is so important because the Nile becomes the transportation for information, for when they build those pyramids, those stones that they're going to use. A lot of things were being utilized on the Nile. And the Nile is this great river, and every year it had this moment where it would flood, and after the flood waters would recede back, it would leave a lot of great rich soil. And so the Africans learned how to domesticate their animals and plants out of Africa. So this is definitely, I already said it, it has different kind of regions. It's hot, it's dry, and it also has a Sahara Desert aspect. And so the Mediterranean Sea, it would be on the northern borders and separate from Europe, right? And a lot of people sometimes want to put Egypt everywhere else, but Egypt is in Africa. And so then you have the southern part of Egypt, which is a little bit higher, and this is the land where the Nile River will begin and where the bow that goes from south to north. So it created Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And so why is the Nile so important? Understanding that a lot of people, especially in the early times of settlement, your water was very important. So where you situated yourself, you always needed to be by a great water source. So the Nile has this great water source. But what is so unique about the Nile, not only is this great water source, but it has these aqueducts that kind of splits off from the Nile itself. And so the Africans call it the Happy River. And it was important to the ancient Kemet people or Egyptians because it was the only source of fresh water. And so every year I told you that the Nile would flood onto the land, and after that water, it would leave the rich soil and it would leave this silk on the ground. And that silk would be possible for plants and growth and farmers to plant their crops. So the Nile is so important to Egypt. Also, throughout the Nile River, there are several areas where the water runs into rapids, which they call cataracts, and there are 6 total. And then it says the northern edge of the Nile River spread out onto many small streams that look like they're upside down triangles, and these will be called into the deltas. And this is where most of the fertile land was situated. So when you see over here on this map, these triangular places were the delta. So the people of Egypt, a lot of times, a lot of people, when they talk about Egypt, they talk about Egypt in the time of Cleopatra. And about time Cleopatra comes and is on the throne, it begins to show us the mixed aspect of Egypt. But all before Cleopatra, the Egyptians or the Kemetic people were very dark. And everything they wrote on the hieroglyphics really depicts the color of the people and so forth and so forth. And that is important to truly understand because it is the great dynasties of all of these great men and will-be women and also a young boy, King Tut, that really when you go back and you look at it, it is important to truly understand that they are of the African people that we think of Africa today. So the original people of Egypt were Black Africans. They were proud of their blackness, which is why they always made their monuments with dark clay and so forth and so forth. And so with this, here you are seeing one of the great individuals like Imhotep. You have heard of Imhotep, who was considered the first multi-genius. You know, we will see how he is played when it comes to Hollywood. So in today, people call it Egypt, and if you look at Egypt today, it looks very different based on the people that came in and mixed and so forth and so forth. But in the beginning part of Egypt, many of the people looked at this tent. And so here is a depiction of Imhotep in a Hollywood movie. And so this is typically a lot of times what we are given. Not to say that this is false, but it negates what the first group of ancient Egyptians looked like. So really, Imhotep was darker than this, and this is not really a depiction of him and so forth. And Imhotep is so important because Imhotep is the first kind of doctor, astrologist, scribe. He had many, many other attributes about him, which is why they said he is the first multi-genius, right? He will create the first step pyramid as well. And the step pyramids are very different than the pyramids I showed you guys in the beginning. So it is definitely important to truly understand the dynamics and what Africa really brings and has brought to the picture as it relates to this historical story. So here are the step pyramids that Imhotep will create. A little bit different, has more of a square to it, right? And each level, you know, you can definitely see the levels. And as you see the pyramids that I showed you in the beginning, those are the pyramids of Giza, which still stand today, you begin to see it has a more slick aspect to it because they began to change how they created these pyramids. You also can find these same kind of type step pyramids in central Mexico. Here in West Africa, this is West Africa, and the area called three distinct areas that will come into play: Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. And out of that, they were Arab influenced, so they practiced Islam. And what comes out of it is still, people say to this day, the richest man in the world is not Jeff Bezos, although he is today, but Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a guy, and here's how rich he was. Mansa Musa once took a pilgrimage because in the Islamic faith, all people who are part of the Islamic faith ascribe to take this religious pilgrimage to a place called Mecca. And so he was on his way to Mecca. He takes over 60 people with him in his camp. So just imagine, that's a lot of money of people you got to take, and you're going from West Africa to Mecca. Not only did he carry 60 in his caravan, he also, because there was a great amount of gold in the West, in West Africa, when he went to Egypt and he stopped off in Egypt and he gave a gift to the Egyptian king, and he gave the Egyptian king so much gold that it put Egypt in a depression for 10 to 12 years. So 10 to 12 years, Egypt was in a depression based on the gold Mansa Musa gave as a present. And so West Africa had this ideal, and this is considered the first university in the world. There might have been one up in Europe at the same time, but this is one of the great universities, Sankore, where a lot of the professors at this one, you know, like myself, they wrote over 42 volumes worth of information. So these people all day studied and would write and teach and so forth and so forth. And so what are some of the accomplishments of the Kemetic people? Number one, they were the first people to ever develop a system of writing. The writing was called meta-neture, and that means divine speech. And what is interesting about the Egyptians is it didn't matter what social status you were from, you all spoke the divine speech. Everybody knew the divine speech. And many of the Greeks, when they came, they then called meta-neture hieroglyphics. That is the Greek term, hieroglyphics. The Egyptians, or the Kemetic people, also are the first people to ever make paper, and they made it from a papyrus plant. So they're not only the first to write, but they are the first to begin to really utilize paper and not write on a clay tablet or anything like that. Very revolutionary as it relates to we write on paper today. They also built most of the amazing buildings and sculptures like the pyramids, and you also know like the Sphinx. Now, what is interesting, the pyramids that we see in Giza, you can go in other parts of Africa and they have pyramids as well, different shapes, different sizes, and so forth and so forth. So pyramids were just not in one central location. A lot of people built pyramids because they were considered tombs for the kings to be buried there. Another great thing is they had a great advanced system of science and mathematics, which I was telling you about in the beginning. Because of the pyramids, the way that the pyramids were built, they had to understand an advanced system of high mathematics and high science. They understood the planets and how the stars moved. So I don't know if any of you guys have seen one of the first, I can't remember the name of the Transformers because they had so many of them. But there was that one where they were looking to find the star, and they went to the Museum of American History Museum, and that old airplane told them, you have to look for the three kings. And you've heard stories called the three kings. Well, the three kings are the three stars, and those pyramids I showed you in the beginning all align with one of those three stars. And one of the stars is the North Star, which is the brightest star in our world. So what else? So here is again just pictures of the pyramids. Here's the Sphinx. And the Sphinx is, when you look at it, right, it is a lion's body, but a man's head. And the reason why that is built is because it talks about all of us have an animalistic self, which is a lower part of who we are. But to rise up above, you must rise into your man self. And so that's why this representation of like a lion and our animal self, the reason why we consider it lower than man, because animal does not have the ability to reason, but man does. So that means if you have the ability to reason, that means you should work to take your life to a higher plane above your animal self. That is a part of the hieroglyphs, and that is the papaya, the paper that they were writing on. Also, found in Africa, this is an old bone, the Ashango bone. This is the oldest bone, or one of the oldest bones that had math on there. And so you see, this is the first thought to be a tally stick and a series of tally marks. But later, scientists then suggested that the grouping of the notches indicated a mathematical understanding that goes beyond just counting. So they knew about 10s, 20s, even into 10,000 or 1,000, 10,000, and they knew into millions based on these tallies. And that's what the scientists are talking about. And this is the oldest mathematical bone known to the world, or one of the oldest. Here is what we know as it relates to how we have gotten to the point of where we have our alphabets using ABC. And here is just an example, a picture of how it increased. So the Kemetic people use more as it relates to symbols to represent an alphabet. And then the Semitic people also similar, right? And then you see the Phoenicians, who were great seafarers, you see they began to change how the letters would look. And then the Greeks came and took it and advanced it to these. And then you got the Romans that have taken it, which we now know A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So here's just some examples of each civilization built upon the ancient African civilizations. And so here's just going on a little bit more about what these pictures would represent. And so this is going through the whole alphabet. I put this in here because this is General or Lord Tariq, and you can tell that that is an Arabic name, but he was a Moor from North Africa. And the reason why I put him in here to truly understand, at a moment, 711 to 1492, they went into Spain and conquered Spain, and they stayed in Spain until 1492. And if you understand 1492, that is the moment when Christopher Columbus sails to the west. And so what the Moors brought to Europe, especially into Spain, it brought the Arabic language, their math, their science. When you guys, any of you guys in here have ever had algebra, that is an Arabic mathematics. And algebra means to reason. So that's why algebra has that funny letters and numbers. And a lot of people are like, well, I don't understand numbers and letters. Well, that comes from the Arabic understanding of this math is to help you learn how to reason. That's why you do a lot of different, it's not like multiplication and dividing and adding. It adds another component to truly go a little bit deeper in mathematical understanding. So when 1492 comes, the Holy Roman Empire now steps back onto the scene because Europe was in what was called the Dark Ages at the time, and they were just really not really doing much during the Dark Ages because they were trying to get past, just like we are dealing with COVID-19. They were dealing with the bubonic plague, and it really wiped out like 1/3 of Europe's population at the time. But when 1492 comes, Europe is now bouncing back, and now to put back on the throne in Spain was King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who practiced Catholicism. And so the Moors practicing Islam, and then you also had Jewish people in Spain as well. 1492, they were given an opportunity to convert to be a Catholic, or they had to leave. And eventually they will leave Spain, and Spain will become Catholic, just like it is still today in most parts of Spain. But that is so important because what was brought to Europe from the Moors was the high mathematics that had already been in Africa for centuries before Lord Tariq even went across the Mediterranean to go conquer Spain. So I always like to bring it home by, if you don't think ancient Egyptians were important, then you wouldn't see resemblance of that in our nation's capital. So here is what is called the Tekken, or the obelisk, is what the Greeks called it. And this is a part of Osiris. And there's a story of Osiris and Isis. Osiris had a very jealous brother. Osiris was the next to sit up on the throne. His brother Set did not like it. So his brother Set plots to kill his brother. And what he did was he created a coffin that only his brother Osiris could fit in. And when his brother Osiris got into the coffin, it had some sharp edges and it cut him up into 14 pieces. Osiris' wife, Isis, who was the moon, which in Egyptians, they gave all of these gods kind of multiple attributes. So she was the moon god and all of these things, just like you will hear in Greek and the Romans when they had Zeus and Athena, and all of these cultures were very connected to each other as they began to expand. So Isis finds her husband, and she is putting him back together where he's getting mummified, and it was just one piece that did not come about. And she, in the picture that they have on the hieroglyphs, is she flaps her wings like she's a bird above her husband, and they end up having a son, and the son is Heru, who will avenge his father's death. And these are the Egyptian stories. And so this monument right here is the monument of Osiris. And leading up to it is this reflecting water, which is like a mirror. You would see this in most of the Egyptian king's court as it relates to when you would come into their area. They would have this reflecting river leading to the main part of the city. And so here you have it on the Washington Monument that we call the Washington Monument after George Washington, who was the first president of this new nation, the United States of America. Another resemblance that you can see how important that history is, and understanding that you are seeing history being repeated in certain ways. So you have the seat of Abraham Lincoln, who is the man that after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, is the man that is instrumental before he gets assassinated to putting the Union back together. And his sitting in his chair is a resemblance of Ramses II, who was considered one of the greatest kings in the Egyptian era. All right, so very same resemblance of African monuments. You can find them in our nation capital, and sometimes you can find them in other places as well. And last but not least, as it relates to symbols, this is on the back of your dollar bill of the pyramids, but you see that the capstone is separated. If the capstone is separated, it means it is not complete. that means there's something else for it to do to complete the process. And so here, this is on the back of the dollar that when the founding fathers was using the dollar, this is what they decided to put on the back of the dollar, which is a representation of ancient Africa. And so I end you with this. 2 quotes by Dr. John Henry Clark that says, history is not everything, but it is a starting point. History is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of the day. It is a compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, what they must be. The second quote says, to control a people, you must first control what they think about themselves and how they regard their history and culture. And when your conqueror makes you ashamed of your culture and your history, he needs no prison walls or no chains to hold you. And so, thank you, Ms. Alexander, one, for having this program, because it's not just for the sake of February. It is to understand why understanding African history, understanding the African American contribution in America, and also being a part of a historically Black college and university, it is in the best interest of all of us, no matter what ethnic group you subscribe to, because you are a part of the human race, you are part of the African story. Thank you.
Mr. Holloway, thank you so much. Like, I learned so much personally. So